is my pleasure today to host a talk based on a cover story in the new issue of the National Interest by Seth Jones called Withdrawal Pains, focusing on what would occur if the United States were in fact to withdraw from Afghanistan. Seth is the Director of Transnational Threats Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He will be followed by William Ruger, the Vice President for Research and Policy at the Charles Koch Foundation, and Gil Barndollar, Director of Middle East Studies at the Center for the National Interest. We're looking forward to a lively and even contentious discussion today. But Seth has assured me that even though he will be followed by two speakers who may take issue with some of his stands, that he also does possess a second strike capability. So I will allow Seth to begin the proceedings.
Thank you very much, Jacob. This is an important discussion to have at this time. And I think it will get even more important over the next several months. I think I did not title the piece in the National Interest, but I think it's a great summary of the issue, Withdrawal Pains. So what I'd like to do is provide a bit of a context for this issue, including some of the growing number of pushes for a U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. And when I say withdrawal, I don't mean just a downsizing, I mean a withdrawal. Then what I'd like to do is also look at the challenges with the peace settlement discussions, and then walk us down a road of what would happen if the U.S. Walked down the road of a complete withdrawal from Afghanistan. Something perhaps like what the U.S. did in Vietnam or the Soviets did in Afghanistan, although there are obviously a lot of variations in what that might look like. I won't get to everything, certainly everything that was in the piece, but happy for you to raise these issues in the question and answer in the discussion segment. So I think it's certainly true that we've seen an increase in individuals pushing for a withdrawal. As Senator Rand Paul recently noted, I think we should come home. I don't think we have enough money to be paying to build and rebuild and build and rebuild Afghanistan. Let's rebuild America. To quote another article in the Small Wars Journal, quote, while the Vietnam War was a near strategic defeat, in retrospect, it may yet prove to have been a geostrategic win. The same may prove true for Afghanistan after a U.S. withdrawal. Like a bad investment, a bad business investment, there are times when you must accept one's losses and move on, end quote. I also have some concerns about the prospects for the settlement discussions, although I certainly support the need to continue to talk with the Taliban, to talk more broadly with countries in the region, Pakistan, Russia, on a settlement. And I think it's important to try. I want to talk about the complexities. First, in a book that I published a few years ago from Oxford University Press, I ran numbers on the end of insurgencies since World War II. By my count, of the nearly 200 insurgencies, about 3/4 end on the battlefield, about a quarter or so end with what you might call a draw, and a smaller than percentage of those are a peace settlement. And the challenge is, and there's been good academic work from Barbara Walters and a range of others on peace settlements. There are a couple of challenges. One of them that I wanted to highlight is what you might call the two-level game. This is not just a negotiation, obviously, between the Afghan government and the Taliban, as much as that has been in and of itself a challenge to get them even to sit down together. But at the international level, successful negotiations require agreement on a complex set of issues, including getting the neighbors to buy in, which will be a feat. On the domestic level, I think the situation becomes even more complex. On the Afghan side, there will be a need for President Ghani and he will almost certainly face intense opposition to almost any type of settlement from aspects of the Uzbek, Tajik, Hazara, and the anti-Taliban Pashtun community. And if you go back and look at Afghanistan's history in the 1990s, certainly in 2001, the level of animosity and the lack of trust between a range of these elements, including the Taliban and some of the northern ethnic groups, is significant. The bloodshed has been real. There are also potential concerns within, I think, the broader Taliban movement, as we even saw some of the more successful peace deals, including in Northern Ireland, which has come under stress recently. We had breakaway factions, including the Real IRA, which continued to use violence. I think there would be concerns among elements of the Taliban, the Haqqani network. We certainly have elements like the Islamic State Khorasan, which would not agree to abide by any of the conditions of a settlement. So war would continue. I think because of the complexities along these lines and the data on how insurgencies end, it is worthwhile to ask, what would a complete withdrawal look like? Let me proceed in a couple of steps. First, wanted to outline probably one of the more important issues, and that is to look at the changes in the balance of power. So if the U.S. were to withdraw all of its military forces from Afghanistan, what might occur? And I think answering this question will first requires understanding balance of power politics in the region, since both the Afghan government and the Taliban receive aid from foreign powers. I think on the Afghan government side, the psychological impact of a U.S. military withdrawal would be difficult to overestimate. It would be significant within Afghanistan. I think we'd almost certainly see a growing departure of civilians, including educated personnel, from the country. The European governments, and this has been part of the negotiations over the past several years, I think would almost certainly likely leave Germans in the north, Italians in the west. One can make an argument about how effective they've been, but at the very least, I think we almost certainly see with the U.S. withdrawal, a European military withdrawal from Afghanistan. And at the same time, I think what we'd likely see is an emboldened group of countries that have provided assistance to the Taliban. The Taliban has received assistance from Pakistan. It's received some assistance, including training camps just on the Iranian side of the border. And more recently, we've seen a rise in Russian activism and a relationship with the Taliban, including getting involved in the negotiations. So I think what a U.S. withdrawal would do, just to be very brief about this, is it would heavily shift the balance of power in favor of the Taliban and its outside supporters. The Afghan government would lose much of its on-the-ground military support, and we'd see that balance of power shift potentially dramatically. So with this change in the balance, I think the Taliban's, would certainly conduct a number of fairly aggressive efforts, including propaganda ones. But I think we've already seen indications of what they would almost certainly do. And if we look at major cities in the country, they have arrayed themselves in a position of attempting to slowly encircle major urban areas, preposition forces, improvised explosive device, improvised explosive devices, and then attempt to asphyxiate a range of these cities. The Taliban has predominantly been more successful at this point in rural areas than it has in urban. I think that's been in part because of the support that the Afghan government gets from the West. But I would focus concern on cities like Helmand, Kandahar, Ghazni, Ruzgan, Kunduz, Zabul, where I think we would potentially see a series of steps by the Taliban over time, targeted assassinations against tribal and other influential individuals that support the government. We'd see the Taliban continue to reach out and try to either coerce or co-opt them, rather than necessarily kill them, as they did in the 1990s. I think they would certainly also focus on overrunning district centers as they have in checkpoints. They've also, as we've seen in Ghazni and Kunduz, have focused some of their military efforts on prisons, where they have overrun them and released prisoners from jails. And then I think the question is then to slowly or quickly, and I'll get to this in a moment, focus on a domino effect of taking multiple cities and ultimately Kabul itself. Now, it will be difficult, I think, for the Taliban to control the country certainly quickly. And I think predictions on speed are difficult. If we go back to some of the CIA predictions in the late 1980s when the Soviets withdrew, I'll read one of them very quickly and then I'll wrap it up. Quote, we judge that, this is a national intelligence estimate, quote, we judge that Mohammad Najibullah's regime will not long survive the completion of Soviet withdrawal, even with continued Soviet assistance. The regime may fall before withdrawal is even complete. They were wrong by a couple of years, not in the end. I also tracked down some of Ambassador Khalilzad's statements on the same issue, outlining the potential for a quick collapse. The speed of collapse might be a function of at least three things. One is whether and to what extent the U.S. and other donors continue to fund the Afghan government. That's one. A second is the speed of deterioration of the Afghan security apparatus. If the Afghan National Army and police split and fractured on ethnic lines, and we saw individuals start to focus their support to militia groups operating in the west or the north or other locations, and the security forces collapsed, that would likely speed up the collapse of the government more broadly. A third factor may be what kind of action are taken by other spoiler groups, including the Islamic State Khorasan province. If the Taliban had to shift resources away and focus on fighting on more than one battlefront. So I would say a withdrawal more broadly, it's hard to predict the timing, would almost certainly lead to an eventual Taliban control of Kabul and of multiple cities. I think the Taliban itself is an organization that will have a lot of antibodies in a city, in a country that they control. There are still, even Afghans that did not leave, there are still a number of much more progressive Afghans that would not likely support the Taliban ideology. So I think based on this, and I'll just quickly end, and then we can turn this over to my two commentators here. I think based on the likelihood of a collapse and the concerns that it would engender, and I'm happy to talk about more of them later, I think among others, a significant increase in the terrorism problem. There already is one. I see a Taliban government as significantly increasing, in part because in the middle of a growing civil war, I think they'll have limited capabilities to target a number of these groups, most of whom they're working directly with now. People have often asked, what is Al-Qaeda doing today in Afghanistan? Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent is providing direct assistance to Taliban fighters on the ground, targeted assassination, improvised explosive devices. These groups I think will almost certainly benefit. Clearly a huge blow to human rights, including to women's rights. This is the Afghanistan I think that we face with a military withdrawal. So what I have advocated, and again I'm happy to talk about this in more detail, is keeping a at least a limited U.S. presence that can conduct some counterterrorism missions. I think the goal for the foreseeable future, the next 2 or 3 years, is to prevent a collapse of the government. And I think even a small U.S. force that can prevent the Taliban from taking and holding major cities means that you're not likely to win in the near future, but you're definitely unlikely to lose. And that may be the best alternative going forward, where the focus continues to be building the Afghan capacity And I think if at some point the question is, when does the Taliban recognize that a U.S. presence, much like it's been in Colombia, which people forget, U.S. Forces in Colombia, Operational Detachment Alphas have been there for several decades. They're not going to leave for the foreseeable future. The U.S. is going to continue to keep at least a limited presence there, so it increases the likelihood of a negotiated settlement over time. I think these indications of a potential withdrawal have impacted that. So again, my views are pretty bleak with a complete U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, and I think because of that, I think the U.S. needs to think very carefully about what it leaves in place. Thanks.
Well, Seth, I'm grateful to you for that exposition of the dangers of exiting precipitously from Afghanistan. I'm Jacob Heilbrunn, editor of The National Interest, in case you're tuning in. We're discussing the new cover story in The National Interest by Seth Jones of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And now we will have a response from William Ruger, who is Vice President for Research and Policy at the Charles Koch Institute.
Thanks, Jacob. Seth, your last part there, it's not exactly a recruiting poster for the military, right? Go to Afghanistan and fight not to lose. I think that that's a real challenge in terms of trying to get the American people behind that type of approach. And we saw that similarly in the response to a similar argument that Richard Haass made. Now, Seth focuses his piece on the perils of a U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, and I'll agree in part by saying that all policy decisions are fraught with peril. There are perils of leaving and perils of staying, perils of doing policy A, and perils of following B, C, or D instead. Moreover, there are opportunities and benefits that need to be considered when choosing whether to stay or go. So, all policies are going to have their trade-offs, and there's going to be no perfect solution. Oftentimes, we're talking about some of the least bad solutions, and I think your approach is a kind of argument about here's the least bad. And I guess what I would offer, too, is something that I think was not only the least bad, but actually good for American interests. And I think being here at the Center for the National Interest is a good place to talk about this, because it's a place that prides itself on realism being part of that conversation. And I'm going to offer something that I think is a kind of realist-inspired approach to what is in America's interest in Afghanistan and what we ought to do next. And I think that what realism dictates is that the U.S. withdraws in a careful fashion, but surely from our longest wars, at least withdraws militarily. So I'll try to make briefly the positive case for withdrawal. I think the first thing is that the United States military has achieved its immediate post-9/11 objectives in Afghanistan, and we often forget that. Of course, our objectives and approach changed over time as we fell victim to mission creep, but we got what we needed, even if we haven't gotten everything we wanted to or grew to want. And so staying isn't necessary, in my view, and indeed has its own perils. So after 9/11, we needed to go to Afghanistan with a strong military power. And we had two main objectives, right? First is we needed to cripple al-Qaeda as an effective terrorist organization that could again strike it as it did on that fateful day in September. And we needed, secondly, to severely punish the Taliban for its support to al-Qaeda. And I think we long ago achieved this, and a lot of people in government have said similar things. So, for example, back in 2012, Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta said, yes, we have decimated core al-Qaeda. Then later, Susan Rice said something similar about having decimated al-Qaeda's leadership in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And then just last year, the Pentagon published a report on security conditions in Afghanistan and said the al-Qaeda threat to the United States and its allies and partners has decreased, and the few remaining al-Qaeda core members are focused on their own survival. And then suffice it to say that 17 years plus of being first expelled from power in Kabul and then being battered, killed, on the run, and suffering, that has certainly punished the Taliban. I think they'll take us very seriously when we say that we won't tolerate them providing safe haven to al-Qaeda or other terrorist groups with an intent and capability to hit America. But again, unfortunately, we expanded our war aims well beyond what was necessary or achievable. Some strategists, I think, got it in their head that nation building and social engineering was the only way to make sure that a centrally governed Afghanistan would work, and thus we'd be safer. Others simply saw this as an opportunity to promote an idealistic agenda of expanding democracy and human rights to this remote country with very illiberal ways. And I could say from my own first-hand experience there in 2008, 2009, that there were a lot of actors in the international community who were operating with very bold aims well beyond what was necessary from a strategic viewpoint. Now, I won't deny that many saw all good things going together, that the ideal was necessary for the strategic, but that's very easy for people to do. But I think the fact is that our interests in Afghanistan are actually quite limited and therefore don't require what Seth or others are arguing for. First of all, Afghanistan isn't a geopolitically central country, no matter what enthusiasts for a renewed great game would have us believe. And our economic interests there are modest, to say the least. And if we need to use the military in Afghanistan to promote economic development or the spread of American values, where does that end? And why Afghanistan? Why not other places? And is that even the proper role of the military in the first place, or even the best way to try to create those conditions? And I would also argue that given that social engineering a place like Afghanistan is something that will cost trillions and several generations of effort, we could also argue, is it worth it or even necessary for America's safety? And I think that's what makes my approach, I think, fundamentally a realist one, is it's focused on what America's national interests are, the core of safety, prosperity, and our conditions of our liberal democracy here at home. And so I doubt very Americans think we need to create and fight this generational conflict. And I also think that we could espouse our values. There's no doubt that we can do that internationally. But is the best place to do that in Afghanistan on the ground? So I think our sole interest in Afghanistan is as follows. We need to make sure that the country isn't used as a base for anti-American terrorist operations. And I think neither a footprint there that's permanent nor a central government friendly to the U.S. are absolutely necessary for that, even though the latter might be nice. Now, a second argument, I think, for withdrawing is that the threat today is not the same as the threat was 17 years ago. And so a permanent military presence there is not needed like it was indeed back then. So leaving Afghanistan militarily, in terms of a permanent presence, the way Seth talks about it, does not mean ignoring Afghanistan or ignoring anti-American terrorism. Intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, reconnaissance, these can continue. And should a threat emerge, it can be eliminated through the use of air power or the use of special operations forces without the need for a permanent or large military footprint. And again, prior to 9/11, our problem was not one of not understanding, or sorry, not having the capabilities to hit terrorists. It was the political willpower to do so. That was the problem, and that is not a problem today. And so if a similar type of threat emerges, we can deal with that, and we'll have the willpower to do that with that advantage of hindsight. Third, I think this is a bigger point, is that endless wars, whether it's in Iraq, Syria, or in the Horn of Africa, or in Afghanistan, that these distract us from more important priorities while undermining our prosperity and our civil liberties. So we have great domestic needs in this country that require both resources and our attention, and these wars crowd them out. Secondly, on the foreign policy side, deterring great power conflict and making sure we keep our sea lanes safe for commerce are far more important priorities. And so we shouldn't be wasting our energies on building domestic security forces in a remote country. We should be making sure that we have a military capable of dealing with our most pressing challenges again. And I think the NSS and the NDS seem to recognize this, and we should, I think, take that to heart. And we also shouldn't forget that our country is mired in debt, now topping $22 trillion. And this undermines our economy, which is the foundation of our superpower status. And that's why Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, talked about our biggest threat not being terrorists in Helmand, but our biggest threat being our national debt and deficits. And he was saying that as our greatest national security threat, not merely our greatest threat, period. Fourth, we have got, what have we actually got from the nation-building project there? Beyond our original war aims that I said that we've satisfied. And I'd say not much other than great, I think, human and fiscal costs. And one of the perils in staying is that we'll lose more brave lives and we'll keep throwing away taxpayer dollars on a mission that is no longer necessary and not clearly going to be anything but not losing. And so here are some of those costs, and I know these are relatively commonly known, but I think one can never say these too often. First, more than 2,300 American military personnel have died there. Another 20,000 have been wounded. And while there are fewer deaths recently, we should not be putting any troops into harm's way when we have no path to victory and the mission is no longer necessary. Also, direct costs total about $1 trillion, and that's not counting for future outlays such as veteran care or interest paid on borrowed money. And then the current cost is about $45 billion a year. And as the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, John Sopko, noted, this is more than we spent on the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. And trust me, Kabul doesn't look like Berlin. Plus, the government in Afghanistan is basically corrupt and not exactly a bastion of our values. And then lastly, when it comes to the Taliban here, even according to Seth in his piece, and you should read that piece, it's well worth reading, he says that the Taliban is gaining ground, despite the 312,000 Afghan security troops plus coalition forces operating there. The Taliban has increased its control, increased its high operating tempo. So if that's true right now, when we have 14,000 troops there and the Afghans have 312,000, that won't do the trick. So we are going to be staying there just not to lose. And even then, we're slowly being eroded, right? And the Afghan government is slowly being eroded. So does this mean that we need to go even bigger? Well, that might be one conclusion. But if we go bigger, how much bigger? Given that we had 10 times the number of troops there back about a decade ago, and that didn't get the job done. So do we have to go even bigger than we did? I mean, is this a 200,000, 300,000? Or really is it simply that we're going to stay there and lose slowly? And I don't think that motivates very many people to fight that. And so I think that we're really stuck in an exercise with no end in sight unless we're willing to really pull the plug on this and withdraw. And I think withdrawal would better serve our interests. And it doesn't hurt our credibility. I think that our credibility isn't enhanced by fighting not to lose. I think that diminishes it. And as Barry Posen has noted in one piece, he talked about how withdrawal would create challenges for those countries who do have interests in that region, and they'll have to pay the costs that we right now are carrying. And then lastly, I'll quote Professor Etzioni, who noted that in the national interest, that there is no sign the fighting will end if we insist the Taliban must respect America's notion of liberal democracy. So it may be that we have to get rid of that part of the project anyway, if we haven't already, and therefore the kind of costs that Seth talks about are going to be incurred. They're already in the equation. Unless we really are willing to stay for generations and pay those trillions of dollars, and even then, who knows? And I don't think I want to have my kids fighting there. I don't think Americans want to. I certainly don't want to deploy there again with my kids in a few years. And so I think in conclusion, we need to ask ourselves, when can we be done? And I say soon. I say let's negotiate an end to our involvement in the conflict, get what we need in terms of commitments from the Taliban not to provide support or safe haven to al-Qaeda or other anti-American terrorist groups, and then get the heck out.
I'd like to thank William Ruger for that succinct and forceful response. Like Will, Gil Barndollar is a veteran of the Afghan War. He is now the Director of Middle East Studies at the Center for the National Interest and will offer the second response to the case made by Seth Jones for withdrawal from Afghanistan, against withdrawal.
Thank you, Jacob. I think I'll make one major point here, given everything that's been said already, and that is that the current situation, I think, is not sustainable. There's an assumption you see in Washington, I think in the foreign policy establishment, that again, we can just sort of, in Stanley McChrystal's words to Mike Pompeo recently that came out, just kind of muddle along, was his quote. Seth sort of alludes to that as well, and I think Richard Haas's comment not too long ago about playing not to lose and just sustaining the status quo, and given the perils of withdrawal, we can sort of just kind of keep kicking the can down the road. I will tell you, I don't think that is tenable, and I think we're already seeing plenty of signs, even I think what's out there in the open source about how things are slowly but steadily getting worse in Afghanistan. SIGAR, John Sopko's reports were alluded to earlier. if you're ever having a great day or week and you take yourself down a little bit, I'd recommend spending a few hours with some of those. It's always grim reading. And he has, at latest count, 43% of Afghanistan is under either Taliban control or contested. And understand that contested can mean a very minimal vestigial government presence. That is the most, I should add, since 2002, since we came into Afghanistan. Other observers, the Long War Journal has it at more like 64%. He thinks that the Resolute Support Mission jukes their numbers, and that really we're looking at almost 2/3 of the country is either contested or under Taliban control. Sigar also admits that 7 more districts fell to Taliban control just in the last 6-7 months since the summer. So that's another 2% of the country just in the last 6 months has fallen under Taliban control. Even more importantly than the sort of district math and the government influence or control is the state of the Afghan security forces, the Afghan army and police. That sort of, kind of typical third world alphabet soup of different agencies, of which the ANA is the biggest one carrying the load. So the NSAF have taken 29,000 killed in action since 2015. At the confirmation hearings recently, Lieutenant General Ken McKenzie, who's taking over in CENTCOM, he admitted those numbers are not sustainable. Despite the Afghans, supposedly we were told that the Afghan government insisted those numbers be kept classified. General Mattis let slip at a speech at USIP a couple of months ago when he was still Secretary of Defense that there were 1,000 of what he called the Afghan lads killed just in August and September. So the Afghan security forces, especially the Army, are taking casualties at an unsustainable rate. The ANA loses 3% of its force every single month, so over 1/3 of its force in a year to attrition. That's desertion, that's wounds, guys not coming back from their wounds, and that's people deciding not to re-enlist and voting with their feet. So that Army has to replace 1/3 of its force every year. That is also not sustainable. The Afghan force, 314,000 on paper, give or take. Those numbers, as we've all probably heard, are inflated by ghost soldiers, by guys on the rolls, where that money is actually being kept by their commanders or being otherwise steered into corruption. So if we take that number at face value, they're about 40,000 below what they're supposed to be by establishment, by Western goals and projections, and they can't sustain it. ANSAF recruitment is also drying up. The Times has written on that repeatedly in the last few months. The official in charge of ANA recruitment in Helmand Province says he sometimes hasn't seen a new recruit for weeks. So as casualties have mounted, as attacks have gotten worse, especially some of the spectacular attacks on cities by Taliban forces and by other actors, that has further disincentivized Afghans from enlisting in their army and their police forces. So we're in a spiral where everything is going downhill. I think that's pretty clear. And the other big point is that a lot of this is exacerbated by how we built the Afghan forces. Having done this job, and I know Seth has advised on this, and I think Will may have been involved in this as well, we have done a pretty horrendous job of building Afghan forces. We've built them in our own image, and a big part of that has been building elite units, which I think Seth's article refers to a little bit towards the end. So we've replicated sort of our habit and predilection for building elite units, for building a large special operations component. The Afghan commandos, the Afghan special forces units, the TEHAS, the kind of Afghan strike units, the CIA's counter-terror pursuit teams have gotten some press recently in the last month or so in the New York Times as well, unfortunately. All those units carry the majority of the offensive fighting load in Afghanistan. However, as a result of building these units, the Afghan army is cannibalizing itself, is leeching its best people, the guys that should have an outsized impact in conventional units, its best officers and NCOs, get pulled in these elite units. So as a result, Afghan security is resting on an increasingly thin reed of an overworked special operations component. We did that in Iraq as well. It worked to some degree. The Golden Division, the Iraqi counter-terror forces were used successfully to retake Mosul and to fight against ISIS. However, we pushed that force to the nub, and they had tremendous U.S. support in terms of air power, Iranian militias, Iranian-supported militias, all kinds of other forces, and that succeeded. I would tell you in Afghanistan, I don't think that model is going to be successful long-term, and I think we're already starting to see that. The fighting in Kunduz and Ghazni, if you follow those attacks over the last couple of years, bears witness to this. Those forces that were sent to retake those cities from the Taliban and successfully did so were often, comparatively small numbers of elite Afghan forces with heavy support on the ground, right in the thick of fighting from U.S. Special Operations Forces. And this is to say nothing of the fiscal unsustainability. As you all, again, probably know, the Afghan government would have to, if it did, honestly pay its own security forces. It would have to spend its entire budget, essentially, to pay its security forces. So that bloated security sector, again, whose numbers you can't even trust in terms of who's on the rolls, is paid for by Western donors and can't exist on its own. So really, there's only one metric in Afghanistan that's going up, and that's the number of bombs being dropped. We dropped over 6,000 bombs in Afghanistan in 2018, which is the most we've dropped since we started keeping track of the numbers in 2006. So we've got a lot of trend lines going the wrong direction. I hate to say it, but after 17 years, I scoff when I hear about building Afghan capacity. There's been very limited evidence of any of that really successfully happening, unless we're going back to day one we took over a broken state. Certainly in terms of making real tangible progress on the ground. So we're not at a point, they're not helicopters on the rooftops of Saigon yet. We're not at that moment certainly, and we could kick the can down the road for a while. But I think the idea that this status quo is sustainable long term until we can, something drops from the sky, we figure out a better long-term plan, I don't think that's really tenable. Will's also spoken about the U.S. national interests, and I don't think I have a lot to add there. So I guess the question becomes, if we do think this is unsustainable, if we do decide we're not going to plus up, and we're not going to throw good money after bad, what are our options? We've talked a little bit about Afghanistan's neighbors, all of whom have much greater interests, and should be carrying the load there. Whether we're talking about the Russians, whether we're talking about the Iranians, whether we're talking about the Chinese. Just a piece this morning about the Chinese sitting on the border watching Afghanistan and their increased role there. They've denied reports in the past about their intention to build a base in their little corner of the border there. I'll tell you what I would advocate is essentially, for lack of anything else, I'll call it the Terminator doctrine, is that we'll be back. It is much easier, much cheaper for us to treat Afghanistan as increasing this borderline ungoverned space where the government is retracting, and it's probably not going to be able to, I agree with Seth, it's probably not going to be able to hold out long term against the Taliban. We treat that as a place where we can go back in I'm not talking about infrared kind of special operations rates. We can go back in a large capacity in a punitive expedition, which is essentially what we did, a longer term punitive expedition in Syria with allies, is the caveat. We can go back in and punish the Taliban at will. That one thing we have tremendous capacity for in the U.S. that nobody else has is projected power. But we're not using that as we try to engage in this kind of failing, fruitless effort to build an Afghan state and an Afghan army that can stand on their own. So I think I'll leave it there and open it up for questions.
I think I should give Seth 5 minutes to respond to both of the respondents.
Thanks. Great comments, and I think as all of us would probably attest to, is it's a complex situation. The fact that we're having this debate now 17 and a half years after 9/11 indicates that the situation today is not where anybody would have hoped it would have been in 2001. Let me just make a couple of comments first and then hand it back to you. So one is, I think what's important to note is and I'll be frank about it, I think is the costs from a terrorism perspective of a withdrawal. I mean, every indication that I have seen from the Taliban in the 1990s, from the 2000s, from the 2010s, and today is, regardless of what they may say during negotiations, promising that if they're allowed to retake control, or if they're handed the reins of government as part of a peace settlement, they will promise to get rid of Al-Qaeda. They won't partner with any terrorist groups. I think we've seen several decades of Taliban activism. They have not just not done that, they've actually been quite happy to and a range of the commanders on the ground, work with most of these groups, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, elements of the Tehrik-e-Taliban of Pakistan, certainly Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. I mean, I have, in my time in Afghanistan in U.S. Special Operations, pulled my hair out, as many others have, about relationship with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda commanders in Kunar, or in Kandahar recently, or in Helmand recently, those small numbers. So I think I think we're kidding ourselves if a withdrawal means that we can expect the Taliban can manage the terrorism problem in any meaningful way. So that's point number one. Two is, I think, at least what I'm outlining, is not going back to the large-scale deployment of U.S. conventional forces. It looks a lot more like the U.S. presence in Colombia, El Salvador, Philippines, which is primarily a special operations and intelligence presence. So we're not talking about
large numbers of forces. In fact, quite the opposite. We're not talking about large numbers of casualties. We're talking about very few, if any. I mean, the numbers even this past year were small. We're not talking about just large amounts of money. We're certainly not talking about nation building. We're talking about continuing to provide foreign internal defense and conduct some missions with an important objective here, and that is you know, the goal should not be an infinite presence in Afghanistan. The goal should be to make it very clear that the Taliban are not going to win. And I think one of the things that I'd like to highlight in looking very carefully, even at SIGAR's numbers, in my view, and having looked at a range of insurgencies over time, numbers and percentages of control of territory, largely a useless measurement. Territory can be you know, desert areas and mountainous terrain. What groups need is they need to control population. That is there, as if we go back to Mao, that is the center of gravity of any insurgency. So what do we see with Taliban changes in population control? And this is important. If we go back to the SIGAR data, in May of 2017, the Taliban controlled, this is according to SIGAR data, 13% in May 2017, 13% of the Afghan population. That's the contested areas of about 30%. By mid to late 2018, according to SIGAR data, they're at 12%. So actually a slight decrease in control of populated areas. The areas that are contested at 32%, there's been almost no change of population control in the last 2 years. What it suggests to me is while the Taliban have gained momentum in, or what looks like momentum in increasing their presence in rural areas, it has not led to a significant change in the control of populated areas. In fact, what most conversations I'm aware with some former Taliban are frustrations that they have not been able to control any urban areas. They control, unlike Islamic State in Raqqa or Mosul or Fallujah or Ramadi, the Taliban controls no provincial capitals, no major urban areas. This has been quite a limitation, in part because these are areas where they do not have popular support. So the goal here is not an interminable U.S. presence. The goal is to make it very clear that they cannot win over the long run. And this is my single biggest criticism even of the current administration, where at the same time it talks about a peace settlement, as it does, leaks out into the press about a possible withdrawal of U.S. forces. It leaks out the president wants to get U.S. forces out, much like where the U.S. is going in Syria. And if you're a Taliban negotiator right now and you're smelling the political winds in Washington, then it looks like the current president wants to get out, like he's going in Syria. Why would you settle now? You're going to wait this one out because that's going to improve your prospects. So in part, my view is as hard as Ambassador Khalilzad has been working, he's been undercut by some of the political comments in Washington. So I think the objective is to keep a small footprint that gets us to where we already are as a stalemate, but where we don't have this increasing leakage that the U.S. may or may not leave in the foreseeable future. And that looks a lot more like what we've seen in other places, including, I think, in Colombia. So I think that's that's where I'll sort of end this, is there is an objective. It is a stalemate. I think it's certainly achievable. I don't think the Taliban, having worked against them for nearly 20 years, is anywhere near as strong as many people view them. And I think even a Taliban that was able to control a number of cities would face large-scale resistance. So let me just say one last comment, and that is, I think that the idea that if the U.S. were to leave, it would be easy to come back would potentially be problematic. And in the sense of when we came back after the Obama administration left Iraq and took a lot over time of domestic criticism, the Iraqi government was happy to have us back. Would a Taliban government be happy to have American forces come back into their country? were to conduct strikes, especially if it had a relationship with other governments in the region. That's a much more dicier situation. So I think some of the downsides of a withdrawal are significant, and some of the benefits of leaving have been overstated.
Thank you. That was Seth Jones of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I will kick off with the first question and then go to the audience. Seth, in listening to your talk here today, it occurs to me that Afghanistan is often referred to as the graveyard of empires. Now, in this case, it may not be the funeral ceremonies are conducted for America's imperial aspirations, but nonetheless, is this in fact the graveyard of the Bush doctrine? Because what you are outlining is in fact quite limited. And after 17 years, the question poses itself, was the project fatally flawed from the beginning, or was it hopeless? Because what you're outlining is so far off from the aspirations with which America initially embarked upon its war in Afghanistan.
Yeah. I think there were probably 2, maybe 3 major miscalculations since 2001. One of them, and there were several periods where this mistake was made, was not to bring in the Taliban right from the beginning, including at Bonn, into what a future looks like in Afghanistan. I think regardless of the Taliban's challenges in controlling urban terrain, it's clear, where I've seen polling data in the country, there are rural areas that are conservative that the Taliban does have some support. And I think it was a big mistake not to have included them early in the beginning, including, and in particular at Bonn. In fact, quite the opposite. The Taliban got the message that unless they quickly defected, they were headed to Guantanamo Bay, which meant that they went to primarily to Pakistan for the foreseeable future. The second, I think, was a mistake in looking at counterinsurgency as about large numbers of American forces to win a campaign for locals. And that was just as true in Afghanistan as it was Iraq. Large numbers, over 100,000 in both countries, to win a war for locals. And I think that theory, in my view, has been absolutely decimated by what we've seen. In fact, some of the more recent successes against the Islamic State in both Iraq and Syria were a much different strategy, much closer to what I'm talking about. Leveraging local actors both in Iraq, the counterterrorism service in particular, with small numbers of U.S. forces, and the same on the Syrian side of the border with Syrian Democratic forces, mostly Kurdish militia forces, and some Sunni Arabs, with small numbers of Americans. That's, I think, much more manageable over the long run, much more possible from a political standpoint as well, and the costs are much lower than they are in flooding a country with large numbers of conventional American forces and spending large amounts of money on countries that really can't even process that kind of outside aid, and where it does fuel corruption. So I think this idea of going in big, particularly from foreigners, has been decimated. And I think I would like to take that theory of winning in counterinsurgency and go back to my first book on Afghanistan and to toss it onto the dustbin of the graveyard of strategy.
Excellent. We have the first question right here.
Thank you very much. My question...
Okay, wait, there's a microphone coming in. Please identify yourself.
Thank you very much. I'm Sadanand Dhume. I'm with the American Enterprise Institute, and I also write a column on South Asia for the Wall Street Journal. And my
There's
question...
a microphone right there.
And my question...
I'm Sadanand Dhume from the American Enterprise Institute and the Wall Street Journal. And I have a question both for Mr. Jones and Mr. Rouge. I'll keep it very brief. It's a question about the U.S. policy towards Pakistan. Now, I would say that a year ago there was a sense that the Trump administration had decided to rethink policy towards Pakistan and was going to act much more aggressively against safe havens, or in an attempt to pressure Pakistan, and it's certainly attempted to do so by cutting military aid and so on. It seems to me that since then there's a growing realization that the U.S. in fact may not have that many cards to play in terms of in fact changing Pakistani behavior. So I guess the first part is, do you agree with this assessment? And if you agree with this assessment, does this weaken or strengthen both of your arguments?
I mean, I'm not sure we have the levers to change fundamental Pakistani interests, and therefore they're going to proceed based on those. You know, if you think about the kind of balance of interests and balance of wills, we're on the wrong side of that equation. And you know, look, I've learned from the guy to my right about this, right? In order to stop terrorist groups, you have to be able to seal those borders, because otherwise they have safe havens and G-locks for resupply and R&R and so forth. And we can't do that. And so that questions our whole ability to accomplish any of the goals we have there. So I think that's why a kind of heavy dose of realism about what can be achieved is absolutely in order, given some of these fundamentals. It's just very hard to, you know, we can project power, that's true. We're the greatest force in terms of projecting power that mankind has ever seen. But even then, we have our challenges relative to others. And so I think that's a big barrier to us achieving anything more than slowly losing or not losing.
I mean, this is a good question. And I think if you look at the president's comments when he announced the South Asia strategy at National Defense University, and then his tweets on New Year's, I can't remember if they were day or New Year's Eve, a year ago, a little over a year ago, there was clearly tough talk. And I think at least when H.R. McMaster was the National Security Advisor, there was an intention to be tougher on a range of levers, not just the coalition support funds, but potentially looking into issues of non-NATO ally status and the state's sponsor. So I think once HR left, I think that the U.S. focus has shifted dramatically towards China and Russia, and what you rightly noted is in the National Defense Strategy, and it was mostly tough talk with very little action. The U.S. has little leverage. I certainly agree with that, but I think we are in a stage today where I think, and I certainly hope, Pakistan can be quite helpful. And my understanding is that Ambassador Khalilzad has been at least happy that Pakistan has been involved in the negotiations. I think the challenge is if they don't succeed, where do we see Pakistan is going? I mean, I think it's certainly, we see the U.S. developing, I'm not necessarily saying this is where it should go, but we see it developing stronger ties to New Delhi. Pakistan's relationship with Saudi Arabia has improved. China it's a complicated one. But I think moving forward, I think it is worth continuing to work very closely with Pakistan on a peace deal, because no deal will happen without their support. I don't know to what degree it's likely, but I will say it's certainly in their interest to see an end to the war to some degree.
Well, we have a number of questions. I'll right all the way in the back.
Marvin Weinbaum, the Middle East Institute. Do we perhaps have the wrong conception of what defeat looks like? Are we very likely using as our model what happened in the 1990s, when the government, the state collapsed and the Taliban simply walked in and took over? Is there not now a very different picture here? Because in the 1990s, you had a cohesive force on both sides. You had the leadership of Mansour. In the north, you had Mullah Omar. These were cohesive, largely cohesive, more so with the Taliban. Today, the picture is much more confusing. there are dissenting elements on both sides. And so what I'm saying here is the possible outcome here not going to be a Taliban regime which replaces a democratic constitutional government, but rather a rather chaotic civil war, ethnic group against ethnic group, elements of the insurgency against other elements, and I don't just mean Islamic State and Al-Qaeda and the mainstream of the Taliban, but even within the Taliban, there is dissent. And that in that picture, and I'll conclude with this, in that picture, the idea that the neighbors somehow are going to then put it together, isn't, and here we can use the 90s as our model, isn't it much more likely that they will have their clients, their proxies, and instead of having a situation where they're bringing peace on in the situation, they are actually fueling that civil war. And finally, that civil war also then would have implications, chaotic situation there for Pakistan and its own insurgency, the insurgencies in Central Asia. So it's a much larger screen that we're looking at here. And I think that to see it in simplistic terms is, well, we lose, they take over, and let's hope that they do well, would be very simplistic.
Seth?
Sure. Good comments, Marvin. I've got three responses. One is, I mean, I think the immediate, and I say this in the piece, the immediate response in Afghanistan to a withdrawal is a bloody civil war. Multiple sides are well armed, and I think as we've already seen in not just in the south but in the north, parts of the west, certainly in the east, there are well armed local militia groups that are willing and able to fight. Some may be more likely to ally with the Taliban, some may not, but there are a lot of avenues for deterioration of bloodshed. Two is, I think you're right. When you look at the history of the country and you look at where the neighbors today are operating, virtually all of them will provide assistance to the Afghan government and their local proxies, whether it's with Hazaras or militia forces in the west, including Dostum, including support from Iran, whether it's Indian support in various places, or Central Asian governments or others, that you'll have multiple sides backed by their own outside supporters. So there's a proxy element. But I think the third point is, as we look at Taliban operations in the past 3 years, a withdrawal is a huge morale blow for the government, particularly if it's both a U.S. and a European departure from Afghanistan. And I would strongly suspect, if I were betting, that what we'd see is a Taliban reattempt at a couple of cities. Controlling the whole country, it's going to be a lot more difficult, especially when faced with well-armed militias. But taking a couple of cities and then using them as a domino, I think is a much more likely option. I mean, if the Taliban can capture Kunduz for a couple of days with U.S. forces, without them, they're going to control Kunduz. I think you'll see them push on Lashkar-Gah and Kalat and Tarankot and Uruzgan. So I that's where I'd say I don't think that's naive to assess that they would do that. They've already tried. Without U.S. and European forces, I think they'll likely succeed. Doing that across the country, that's a little bit more difficult, and I think that's why we'd see Taliban growing control of a number of areas as the country more broadly spirals into a really bloody war.
Does either of you have a...
Yeah, just adding on that, it's a great question, but I think it goes both ways. You're absolutely right about the lack of the Taliban as a fully cohesive group, never mind ISIS-K, the Haqqani group, other groups that are both allied or adversaries on that side of the equation. But on the other hand there, if the Taliban maintains reasonable degree of cohesion and central control after a U.S. withdrawal and government forces fracture along ethnic lines. The Hazaras have been mentioned are going to be very unlikely to sign on to any deal and to trust the Taliban back in power.
On you. I will start with George Beebe, is at the top.
Question. The comment has to do with some potential side benefits down the road to a U.S. withdrawal that I don't think we've addressed in the discussion so far. And that has to do with dealing with Russia and China as geopolitical competitors. For the past decade and a half, I think the United States has unintentionally done a very good job of incentivizing Russia and China to cooperate with each other against U.S. interests. Central Asia broadly, including Afghanistan, is an area where they have basically put their natural geopolitical rivalry aside in the interest of opposing what the U.S. is doing there, particularly our military presence. I think over the long term, as the U.S. military presence in the region begins to subside, that natural geopolitical rivalry between Russia and China over that region comes to the fore again. And that may have a subtle but significant effect on rebalancing that triangular relationship that we have there with those two countries, and that is in our interest to see happen. My question has to do with the Taliban and international terrorism. There seems to me to be a tension within the panel in looking at the degree to which the Taliban actually supports anti-U.S. terrorism. And this goes back to the 1990s and our assessment of their role back then with al-Qaeda and anti-U.S. terrorist operations. Was the Taliban then, and would it also after a U.S. withdrawal, very focused on conducting terrorism outside of Afghanistan or the immediate neighborhood? Or could it live with a situation where we basically say to them, look, here's the deal. You make sure that Afghanistan is not a base for international terrorist operations against the U.S. and the West, and then we can live with an awful lot short of that, provided that you agree to those terms. And we have the military wherewithal to enforce that as an offshore operator. Is that not viable? And Seth, you in particular seem to be thinking that that can't work. And I'd like to get into a little bit of depth in addressing that question, because I think it's a key question for deciding what options we have.
Yeah, I think this issue is a really important one. I'll give you my sense. One is first to note that the Taliban itself as an organization, including its version of Deobandism, is a parochial organization. Its interest is not participating, other than rhetorically, in any kind of a broader caliphate. So the Taliban is a parochial organization that is primarily interested in controlling some or all of Afghanistan. That's about it. That's worth noting. Second, I still think it's wishful thinking to expect or even hope that the Taliban, especially if it believes it's winning, and especially if it believes as part of a U.S. withdrawal that it is out-negotiating the United States, that it would be willing, based on its past actions, to break relationship with groups operating outside of Afghanistan. And I would break this down into three types of groups or categories. One is, my understanding, and having dealt with some of them in the past, there are differences of opinion among the Taliban's inner shura about this question, and there have been for some time. There have been some that have felt that a number of these groups have fought and died alongside of the Taliban. They were unwilling to break ties after 9/11. They may rhetorically at some point, but these groups have played very important roles in the fighting. Second, regardless of what elements of the Taliban's inner shura believes, what we've seen in practice is that local Taliban commanders are happy to work with local groups depending on cost-benefit analysis. So, even regardless of what we see individuals in the Quetta Shura, the Rabari Shura believe, that we've had plenty of individuals that are local Taliban commanders willing to do it. And the third issue is if the Afghan government and the Pakistan government have had difficult time with significant U.S. presence, conducting attacks from JSOC forces, airstrikes from the U.S. intelligence community operating, if they've had a challenge, the idea that the Taliban is going to be able to do this with virtually none of those resources strikes me as highly unlikely. So I think when I, certainly acknowledging that the Taliban itself is an organization primarily interested in Afghanistan, I have very limited expectation that the Taliban will be either interested or able to cut its ties or conduct action against most of these groups, with some modest exceptions. Islamic State Khorasan province has been an enemy that they have fought. So with some modest exceptions, I think that's a pipe dream.
Any comment here?
My understanding from, and I can't remember if it was Stephen Cole or Wright in the Looming Tower, is that the Taliban was very close to giving up bin Laden before 9/11. And that suggests an element of realism that maybe we can take advantage of with the post-Omar Taliban that knows what could happen if it doesn't play ball. And we can make some reasonable assurances if they will. And so I think you have to adopt not just the stick, but the carrot. And so there may be opportunities to incentivize the Taliban, whether it's in Kabul or if it's in Kandahar or wherever it is, to play ball. Now, the fact that they can't control every actor in Afghanistan, to me, doesn't suggest that we need 14,000 troops on small bases in Afghanistan. Again, that's why I think really, speaking what Gil was saying, is that the strategy, I think, of really light footprint and an Afghan government that isn't losing so much, or it's slowly losing, isn't really sustainable, and therefore you're going to have the same problem under your scheme. So I really think the opportunity is you have to go much bigger and much longer, or you have to, I think, withdraw with some of the assurances that we can get. And that's why I think these negotiations are critical, because at least we could get some assurances and then we could honorably withdraw and say we accomplished what we needed to.
Yeah, and I would add to that, talking about the stick instead of the carrot, the Taliban, for all of our missteps, for all of our failures to build a sustainable Afghan government and security force, they have seen U.S. power, and they're not, as a parochial, as you said, as a parochial organization that wants to govern its own territory and have its Islamic emirate. They're not eager for an American, I'm not talking about pinprick missile strikes, but a serious U.S. punitive expedition to punish them for international terrorism emanating from within their borders. And that's something we can do. Yes, it's a big muscle movement. Yes, it costs money. Yes, it will result in a short but sharp campaign that would kill Americans. But they've seen what that looks like. They were driven from power in a matter of months, very quickly with U.S. air power and a small amount of guys on the ground, and we can do that again. I think they're not eager to repeat that, to live, as cross-border jihadis, to be treated steadily both in battles and by drone strikes. The number 3 guy in the Taliban was probably the worst job in the world for 10 or 15 years. They're not eager to live that life again. So I think there is, despite all our missteps, there's still a heavy negotiating point we can make that it's a lot more credible to say we'll be back if this happens again.
Our next question is from Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council.
Thanks very much. It's been, almost 18 years now. Mm-hmm. So what can you tell us about the nature of the Taliban now? Have they changed in any way? Are they regretful of some of the activities that they undertook in the past in terms of their restrictions on women and so on? Have they evolved at all, or are they the same old group?
Same old, or?
This is a very, very important question. I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs maybe a year ago about this. I mean, my sense of the Taliban today is twofold. One is we have some indications of it because they do control some territory, so we can see how they operate today. And then we can also see how their ideology has evolved. It is a different Taliban from the 1990s, in my view, in some ways. That gone are the
the desire not to get involved in, they didn't want to get involved in music or the internet. I mean, they have adopted and evolved the way we've seen other Salafi jihadist groups operate, Islamic State or Al-Qaeda. They're not just involved in radio program, they're also pretty involved in social media and the internet. So in that sense, they're different. But on the same time, you could see with the Taliban's justice courts that they have and the type of governance that they rule with, it is antithetical to any of the direction that Afghanistan has gone in terms of women's rights or what we would consider human rights. So I've seen no indication in areas of northern Helmand where the Taliban does control some areas, mostly rural. In southern Helmand, in parts of northern Kandahar, Taliban justice is ruthless. If you don't subscribe to a Taliban ideology over the long run, in areas that they control, they have a rough equivalent to what they had in the 1990s of a committee on virtue and vice that enforces their interpretation of Sharia. And that's the Taliban you get. It's not one, I think you'd see a major retrogression of the advancements that we've seen in the willingness to allow foreign investment into the country, allow women to work, allow non-governmental organizations to operate in the country. A major regression or retrogression. I think that's what we've seen in areas that they control. They talk a little bit different than they did back then. I think the issue, though, is in how they've ruled in areas that they've operated. And it would be something that the U.S. has to live with. That if we were to withdraw, you're turning at least parts of the country eventually over to a very ruthless organization that has a very extreme version of Sharia, and that's something you'd have to live with.
I'd add just two things on that. It's a great question, but to take what Seth said about where the Taliban governs, we should consider those are the most, in terms of development indices, in terms of where those parts of society are at, those are the most backward parts of Afghanistan. You go into Helmand, into Kandahar province, places down there where the illiteracy rate is north of 70%, where it's an incredibly conservative, ancient Pashtun culture. I mean, you go there and you feel like you're in the 13th century with the addition of motorbikes, a couple of solar panels, and weapons. And tractors if you're lucky. That's about it. So, to understand that where they're governing conforms to those local conditions, I've walked through hundreds of Afghan villages and seen, in that part of the country, and seen one woman who wasn't fully covered, and that was a mistake. She got, big quick tracks. So understand the conditions down there, first of all. Secondly, so with that caveat as well, and also Afghanistan has changed just as the Taliban has changed. So I don't know that even I agree that a lot of what the Taliban is saying is lip service. They're not going to be women on the Shura Council or any kind of governing body there, and there'll be major steps back on a whole host of issues. But I think they're going to struggle if they were to take over cities and try to govern those and achieve some kind of progress and run an Islamic State there. I don't think you're putting WhatsApp back in the box. I don't think you're putting a lot of kind of tools and features of modern life that certainly urban Afghans, at least in some of the bigger cities, have gotten used to.
Our next question is from Paul Pilar. Paul is a valued contributor to the National Interest website.
Thanks, Jacob. Seth, you in your opening comments talked about what our goals ought to be looking out, I think, 2 to 3 years. You also made a reference to U.S. presence in Colombia, which of course is much different from Afghanistan, but
sure.
Numbering in the decades. So I'd like to ask you to look out beyond 2 to 3 years in Afghanistan and address the not only how does this end, but when does it end question. Are we talking about decades-long U.S. presence? Are we talking about no visible end at all? And then the second part of the question is, if U.S. political leaders, in an honest and straightforward way, told the American public what your answer to the first part of the question was, what does that imply regarding continued U.S. political and public support for U.S. troops in Afghanistan?
Good questions, Paul. So the one of the differences with the early Trump administration statements with its South Asia strategy was a shift, at least rhetorically, from a time-based to a conditions-based approach. I mean, that lasted, what, a year before we started getting more time-based approaches? So here's the issue. If the research on the settlement components of wars strongly indicates that one of the critical factors, and again, this is Barbara Walters and a number of others that have looked at this carefully, run qualitative and quantitative studies. One of the key factors is a stalemate. So the question becomes, if the U.S. Decides that it's not going to talk about withdrawal, it's going to keep focused on negotiations and then fight, and there are no leaks in American newspapers about a U.S. withdrawal or a possible withdrawal from Afghanistan. What does that look like? And I think if that's the way, if an American president were to say that there's a lot at stake in the country if we were to leave, and that there are important national security interests, at least enough to keep a small presence there. Our focus is to continue fighting against terrorist groups and to push a peace settlement. Then the question is, how long would it take to get to an actual settlement? And I think there are versions of a settlement that bring the Taliban back into the government, or elements of the Taliban back into the government. Allow the Taliban to govern, or at least to play roles of provincial governor, key ministries in the central government if it was deemed, if they had qualified individuals. I don't know how long it would take, and there would be a number of factors. I mentioned this earlier that it might take, but I think that is something that is politically doable as long as the number of casualties stays pretty low. I don't think most Americans are going to care that much. I mean, I think one of the things that struck me after the South Asia strategy was announced and the number of U.S. forces was pretty small is it didn't even make the newspapers anymore. I mean, we spent much of 2016, late 2016, 2017, and early 2018. I'll tell you, for someone like me who spends a lot of time in Afghanistan, it was hard even to get a newspaper journalist to call you up to talk. Nobody cared anymore. It was all Syria and Iraq and other places. So I don't know that most Americans would actually care that much, except if we had a lot of Americans coming back in body bags. And what I'm laying out is such a small presence that it's highly unlikely as we look at what has happened even in Afghanistan over the past several years. So, I think the focus would be, here's where we're going, here's what our objective is. We're not going to promise an immediate withdrawal. We'll pull out as soon as we have something that protects our national interests, and I would leave it at that. And my sense is, as long as we're not losing many American soldiers, Americans are going to be focused on other things.
I can see Will wants to take this on,
Yes.
right?
Well, one of the reasons why Americans maybe haven't been paying attention to this is because in foreign policy, elites are the cue givers that basically prompt Americans to care about something. And I think what has happened is we've had a kind of bipartisan status quo for primacy and the operationalization of that in the Middle East. And here's where I think President Trump has been helpful, because he has broken through that status quo and asked questions like, should we be withdrawing from Afghanistan? Should we be continuing to pay for the burdens of our security commitments fully or largely in Europe? He's breaking this open, and so I think Americans do actually care about some of this stuff if they're given the right cues, and they're provided the information that suggests something that I'll suggest about Paul's question, which is, if we stay for 20 years, that's $1 trillion at the current burn rate. Are Americans in favor of that? If you had a president like President Trump or someone else making the case, a Bernie Sanders perhaps, or a Tulsi Gabbard, saying, look, we can do better things than $1 trillion over the next 20 years in Detroit, in Des Moines, in California than we can in Helmand or Kandahar, then I think people would pay more attention, and so I think then other elites would cover this more. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's important, I think, to be pressing on these issues that have largely gone unchallenged. And I think the fact that that is a pretty heavy price, we should wake up to. I certainly think that there are both liberals and conservatives that can think of a lot of better ways to spend that money here at home than in Afghanistan, particularly because I'm still not hearing from you or anyone else a theory of how we satisfy the aims that we've set out for. You've told us that women's rights are going to basically be surrendered even under your plan. It's not as if they're going to go into those conservative areas that Gil talked about and change what's going on when you say in your own piece that the Taliban is in control of these sections and it is actually gaining operational kind of control in those places. So I just think that there's a lot of challenges here that really need to, I think, be pushed on a little bit more.
Can I just quickly respond? This is an important conversation. I think these discussions actually lay out the most important issues. I would just respond in two ways. One is, it's one thing as I look at recent SIGAR numbers, if we're talking about 12% of areas controlled by the Taliban today by SIGAR numbers. It's another if we're talking about 80%. So, that's a huge change in control of populated areas. The second thing is I noticed that the numbers I'm talking about are not $1 trillion over 20 years. I'm talking about small numbers of special operations forces, which are orders of magnitude less in costs of money and certainly not large amounts of development assistance. So I think, in that sense, and I didn't cost it out for this piece. I did a couple of years ago in a separate CFR piece, Council Formally, with much lower costs than that. So, I mean, I think the costs are much lower, and I think when we look at Taliban control of areas, 12% is one thing, 80% is another.
Marvin Ott from the Wilson Center.
Thank you. Marvin Ott, Wilson Center and Johns Hopkins. As Seth said, this is an important conversation, so I just wanted to commend the quality and salience of everything that's been said. I've got a fair amount of gray hair, and like a number of others around the table, my formative influences in these subjects came in Vietnam. Born and bred in that era, studied in that era, was out during the war. And I'm sort of, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. I'm sort of startled by how much the discussion that's been going on here sounds like Vietnam, say, 1971. And I could imagine this exact same conversation raising exactly the same issues. It's discussing almost exactly the same outcomes would have occurred with regard to Vietnam in that time period. So I don't really have a question, I guess. I just sort of throw that out, is I'm sort of stunned by having Vietnam suddenly resurrected at the table in the way it has been.
I'll just make a brief comment. All that is true, and it occurred to me listening to this as well, but there's one difference, which is that if Dick Cheney were sitting at this table, he would respond to Will's point about the cost by saying, what's the cost of losing an American city? Now, you may consider that demagoguery, but that's the kind of response you will get from the hawkish wing of the Republican Party. That's a little, in that sense, it's different from Vietnam, because Vietnam did not seek to attack, nor never did, the American homeland. So that is one difference. Otherwise, the conversation there are similarities. And the one thing Seth hasn't addressed, maybe you can respond to, is the fact that in Vietnam, the political will for the war collapsed. Has the political will, we can talk all day long about the military consequences, and that's what we've been doing here, but we haven't addressed the fact, is Trump actually tapping into something, and maybe Bernie Sanders, because if Bernie Sanders comes into power, you won't even get the militarism of Trump. You'll just get a more isolationist slant with some social do-gooding. But he certainly will not be seeking to energize the American military and showering it with funds. So is the political will gone?
I mean, I just want to defend Bernie Sanders here and say that I don't think, right? I don't think he's going to be an isolationist. I think he would be more of a restrainer, and I think that's an important difference. I don't think he would want us to stick our head in the sand, and neither do other restrainers. I guess what I would say is, like, and this goes to that point, it's not as if what people who criticize our continued efforts in Afghanistan are saying is that we should come back to America, stick our head in the sand, and not pay attention to global terrorism. We still think that there should be an active role in countering terrorism globally, particularly the terrorism that is where there are groups that are specifically intending to hurt the United States or its forces abroad, and have that capability. And I think one of the problems with this, lose an American city argument is there really that intent and capability? And even if there's that intent, how are they going to do this? I mean, we've been 18 years without that type of attack that we saw on 9/11. Now you could say, well, that's because some of our efforts. And undoubtedly a lot of what we've done has been positive, and we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But the fact is that talking about withdrawing 14,000 troops is not the same as saying, now we're not going to pay attention to global terrorism, we're not going to be using SOF and other assets to try to counter these things, or that we're not going to, as Gil says, come back if there's a threat that is necessary for us to use something bigger.
I mean, just briefly, I don't think we're anywhere near, at least in 2019, the domestic political pressures that we saw in Vietnam in several respects. I mean, the indications are pretty strong during that period. Incidents like Kent State University, the major domestic, in some cases quite violent reactions to the U.S. deployments in Vietnam, U.S. servicemen and women coming back who had to change in the airports or on the airplanes, including my father, because of what he knew he would face if we walked around in a uniform in an airport. We're not facing anything along those lines. So from my standpoint, the domestic backlash or lack of domestic support, if you will, that issue that we're dealing with apples and oranges between the Vietnam era and today.
And Jacob, could I just add something on that point? So polling that's been done by the Eurasia Group Foundation that just actually came out today, and then polling that we've done with the Center for the National Interest, I think really shows that while we don't have Kent State or marches in the street, there is a lot of public concern about whether what we're doing in the world is making us safer or even making other places more stable or secure. And so I think Trump is tapping into that, and I think Trump is a symptom rather than a kind of prime mover here. And so Americans are disaffected from these choices, and I think that that's growing.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, Will, just quickly. Obviously the big difference between now and Vietnam is far fewer people have skin in the game, right? I mean, once Nixon took the draft off the table, suddenly it was a very different discussion. So with an all-volunteer force and also with the deferred cost of these war and the can be kicked down the road as far as paying for this, it's a very different picture that's presented to the American public. That being said, there's one study that really stands out, this interesting little study, I think two academics at BU did it, it's been written about a little bit, but there's a very interesting correlation between casualties taken in Iraq and Afghanistan and counties, Midwestern counties in several states that flipped from Clinton to Trump. So again, correlation is not causation, but it's an interesting study. There's in really tight, political climate with very few voters, in theory, very few voters up for grabs, may or may not actually be true, but you're having an outsized impact even from minor amounts of, historically minor amounts of casualties in electorally contested areas. So I think there's a little more nuance to it than just saying the American public is checked out and doesn't care. The money issue, as you said, burning $4 billion a month, what that looks like over 20 years is a huge one if it's presented the right way.
Well, we may have difficulty extricating ourselves from Afghanistan, but this meeting does have to end in 6 minutes. So I'm going to bundle the two last questioners, one here and one here. Oh, did you have one? Well, we can, and then we can take the third over here. But try to be succinct.
I'll try to be. My name is Roger van Laak. I'm the head of the political department at the Dutch Embassy. Maybe I can cheat a little bit and ask two questions in one. The first question would be for Seth. In your vision, if that became policy, what would that mean for the NATO mission resolute support in Afghanistan? Maybe you can say a few words about that. And then maybe a second question, maybe for all the panelists. I think William already said something about it. I think a colleague in the audience as well. We're now in the area of great power competition. Could you reflect maybe a little bit on the effects of an American withdrawal from Afghanistan on that great power competition in that region?
And we had a question right here.
Yes. Mark Kansian from CSIS. And I have a question for Seth, and the others might want to chime in. But Seth, in your book, The Graveyard of Empires, you were very critical of the light footprint and advocated a major military effort. It sounds like your thinking has come around back to that light footprint, and I was wondering what drove the change in your thinking.
Final question from Ambassador Woodhurst. It's right here.
Yeah. Thank you. One question, one brief comment. My question is, as far as beyond the real concerns on security and political peace process, I guess that one of the last things that the West, and I hope the rest of the international community want, is to go back in time for 20 years or more regarding human rights, and especially the women's rights. I mean, progress has been substantial, I think, in business sector, parliament, government representation, and so on. So you mentioned it, I think, said at a certain moment in your first presentation, your first intervention. But how can we prevent that if the Taliban, in whatever power sharing arrangement or whatever process they negotiate, how can we prevent that we go back 20 years in time? Because this is one of the things one would probably legitimately want to avoid. And my comment, just to bring in a bit of a European perspective, and having been involved in decision making after 9/11 on my government's, but also European participation in Afghanistan, I would just like to flag that among the arguments that have been used to justify increase in presence on the ground, I mean, I think that the alliance with the United States was as important as the relationship or the situation in Afghanistan. I mean, this was really, this was very important for several European governments when they responded. So it had as much to do with the United States as with Afghanistan. And of course, if there is whatever withdrawal decision, then there is another big issue that will come up in Europe, which is refugees. And I think already today, overall, Afghans are, I guess, the second group of refugees in Europe after the Syrian refugees. So this can become pretty major. Thank you.
Well, Seth, I'll let you take the charge.
All right. Just a couple of quick issues. First, I think resolute support has been, is, and will continue to be important from a training perspective, from a financial perspective, including what the European participation leads to on broader EU contributions to development assistance. Certainly adds an air of broader legitimacy. I have served with European countries in Afghanistan on the military side, so they certainly bring an important contribution in addition militarily. I think any future U.S. presence in Afghanistan has to be done as a broader international effort under resolute support auspices with European and other allies. So I think that continuing that is critical. On Mark Kansian's question, I think the empirics here have convinced me that the large presence of American forces, and I when I use conventional forces, I don't mean to say that people are unpatriotic. I just mean some of the individuals I was with in Afghanistan, young 19, 20-year-old individuals from the 82nd Airborne or the 101st Airborne Division that had very limited, if any, training in what they were being put into. I think in retrospect, the U.S. military in general is not educated, trained, prepared to conduct this kind of warfare across the board. So there are specific components of the military that are prepared, educated, trained to do this. So this is where I think, in retrospect, the heavy footprint the military that the U.S. has today is not adequate to that task. And this is where I think, actually, to your great power question, it's a U.S. military and conventional military that was much better prepared for power projection against China, against Russia, and other countries. So I think that's kind of where I come down on that. And then finally, on the human rights issue here, I mean, I think this is a serious issue, and we did not touch on the refugees. I think that would if we replay, and this goes back to Marvin's comment earlier about civil war, if we replay the 90s, even if it looks different, what we saw during that period is large refugee flows out of the country to escape the war, but in part also to escape growing Taliban activity. And I think that means that Iran's going to have to deal with an exodus. Pakistan will, Central Asian states, the Europeans definitely will, because as you noted, it's the second largest refugee population to Syrians. So I think this is a huge additional humanitarian issue, and I think based on how some of the populist elements, including political parties in Europe, have responded to Syrians, I don't see how that changes, and no one's going to want to take Afghans in, or few are going to want to take, or at least it's a politically divisive issue, as we've seen in the UK and France and others.
Any last comments?
Yeah, I mean, what are we willing to pay going forward for this war? And I think the American public is largely saying we're willing to pay less and less for this. And I think that at $45 billion a year right now, just to get what we're getting, that's a high cost, even leaving aside the human cost of people who are affected by this. And there are fewer people dying, but there are still people dying in uniform there. And we ought to be cognizant of whether that's worth it.
Yeah, just to kind of swing through these quickly on great power competition, I think, as has been said, we should be, as George I think brought up, let the Chinese and the Russians and other countries that have direct interest there deal with it. That tar baby is much more dangerous to them than it is to Americans. I don't think the juice is worth the squeeze in terms of potential, outpost footprint in Afghanistan and how that benefits us vis-a-vis the Russians or the Chinese. The rare earth minerals, rare earth metals issue gets brought up. I don't think that's worth what we're paying for some, potential long-term gain there in that arena. As far as the light footprint, Colonel Kenzie, you were seeing both Vietnam and Iraq up close, right? So I agree 100% with Seth. I think the idea of doing especially large third-party expeditionary counterinsurgency is a fool's game. We could maybe do that in Mexico or somewhere nearby. We struggle in some ways to do that on our own soil. I think doing it in a completely alien culture with 19 and 20-year-olds with rifles is not, it's a fool's errand. That being said as well, light footprint though, the proxies and the people we empower, we've seen how that, we're dealing with that mess in Syria now as we disentangle ourselves, and we'll deal with it in Afghanistan in terms of who we built up and what those forces look like, and we could talk about that all day. And as far as female rights in Afghanistan, at the risk of being glib, we're not talking about going back 20 years, and sometimes some places in that country we're talking about going back 400 or 500 years. I don't think the U.S., I don't think that's worth shedding American blood, frankly, and I don't think shedding further U.S. blood and treasure is going to really solve that. That's a societal evolution that we can only influence on the margins.
Well, I think all three of our speakers would consider themselves realists. As always, the question is, in foreign policy, what is actually realistic? Thank you.